The Boston Celtics and Dallas Mavericks have both dominated their way through their respective conferences, with Dallas losing 5 games on their way to the finals and Boston losing just 2, but both represent for each other their biggest challenges yet. Will the regular season and playoff dominance of a weaker conference from the Celtics translate versus the first legitimate contender they faced, or will the late bloomer Dallas Mavericks, who are leaving the conference finals with some battle scars, ultimately prevail? Who will win the 2024 NBA Finals? Let's talk about it. Hello everybody, welcome to Also Rusty Buckets. If you are watching this over on YouTube and you are not already, please be sure to subscribe. I am trying to hit 200,000 subscribers by the end of the year, so your subscription would be much appreciated. Also drop a like, and if you are listening over on Spotify, drop a like as well, give us a 5-star and follow. All that's good stuff. But with that said, let's get into this series. Well, actually, I do have to say one thing. Rest in peace to Bill Walton. The news of his death unfortunately came like right after I recorded the original video and it was about to go up. Bill Walton, probably one of the more underknown in terms of his actual playing career NBA players. He's one of the few players from the 70s that actually interests me in terms of my own political opinion stuff. I felt like he was generally on the right side of that stuff, like he was protesting the Vietnam War, regardless of how that affected him or his career, and I really respect that. He also is just an interesting thinker, somebody who thinks out loud a lot. Frankly, I think the dude had ADHD, and as someone who has it himself, I saw myself in him quite a bit. Rest in peace to Bill Walton, an NBA legend, both from what he provided in his actual career, winning an MVP, winning a championship in Portland, but also as a commentator, just as a general mind. He's just a very interesting guy to listen to, and it's unfortunate that we won't be able to hear him yap about random shit during broadcasts anymore, because it was fun. We're gonna move on to the finals now. Rest in peace, Bill Walton. Alright, so I've tried to structure these videos of the series previews in the past, and it really just kind of devolves into me talking about random points, so I'm just gonna do that instead, and hopefully it's structured well enough. I do want to mention there was one regular season matchup between the Mavericks and the Celtics that was post-trade deadline, which I think is a very important thing to emphasize for this Mavericks team, because they're just a fundamentally different roster beforehand. Obviously, we can get an idea of coverages and things like that don't change just because PJ Washington and Daniel Gafford are on the team now. However, they do at the very least fundamentally change how this roster works. So I watched that game back just to get an idea and get a decent idea of the matchup approaches here. So the first thing that matters the most, will Porzingis play? And if so, how long will he play? How well will he play? Is this like a he's playing but he's kind of clearly 70% at most? Or is this like, hey, I'm ready to go now? Because a calf strain doesn't necessarily sound like a crazy bad injury. I do think there's a spectrum of severity there, but Porzingis himself made a post, I think on Instagram, suggesting that he's going to try to be back for the finals. Joe Mazzulla said that it is up in the air whether or not he plays in game 1, so that is a huge factor in all of this. Obviously, there's a week-long break that he gets to rehabilitate and hopefully get his body right, but at the end of the day, we don't know what his health is going to look like, and I think that dramatically affects the result of this series. So as far as the Luka matchup, which is the first thing you really think about, do you prioritize having size on him or just more talented defenders who are smaller but also have less of an offensive burden to bear? I am of course talking about Jrue Holiday and Derek White versus the alternative of putting Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown on him. Now, I do think that is a valid approach either way, because you do want to save Tatum and Jaylen's energy on the offensive end, especially Tatum. However, I also feel like the Luka physicality will outdo the defensive talent of Derek White and Jrue Holiday. Between the two of those guys, I would probably elect to go with Jrue Holiday, because I've just always gotten the impression he was the more strong and physical defender than Derek White. Not that Derek White isn't those things, just that, you know, Jrue is a little bit more of those things. Even though I think Derek has a slight height advantage, I think that Jrue probably has a strength advantage. If I had to guess, they probably start with Derek, or Holiday on him as the initial matchup. Throughout this March 1st game that I watched, he got basically everybody throughout the game between those 4 names that I previously mentioned. But yeah, I think depending on the lineups you have in the game, you probably go with Holiday or White on him initially. You see how well he's able to actually take advantage there, because if it's not that big of an advantage, I think you're cool with that. But ultimately, if it is, I say you put Jaylen Brown on him as the initial matchup and then close with Jason Tatum, who I believe to be the best overall in terms of versatility and size perimeter defender on this team. Derek White and Jrue Holiday are both more talented defensive players, but they are not 6'9" with long arms. Jaylen Brown, not as good off of the ball. Luckily, Luka is a very on-ball player, so if you do have to, there's not a lot of stuff you have to worry about with him off of the ball. He's almost always going to be engaged on that end because Luka is actively in front of him with the ball. From there, Kyrie is probably going to get either Derek White or Holiday, depending on who ends up getting that Luka matchup, and I do think that Kyrie might have some struggles in this one. Obviously, there was some trash talk in the series last with Minnesota and like Anthony Edwards saying he could defend Kyrie. Thus far, no one's really defended Kyrie all that well, except Derek White and Jrue Holiday are maybe the 2 best guard defenders in the entire league, and they happen to be on the same team. So it's not necessarily going to be an easy going for him at the very bare minimum. You hope he doesn't see the defense too much, but that is really, if I am Boston, I think I focus more on shutting down Kyrie Irving than I do Luka, because shutting down Luka when he's healthy, and he seemed to be healthy to close that, or really just throughout the entire Minnesota series, and again, he's going to get this week just like everybody else. I feel like it's more possible, I don't even feel like, I know that it's more possible to shut out Kyrie Irving. The one game that Minnesota managed to win in this series, it is because they shut out Kyrie Irving. Kyrie had a bad game, now he had a bounce back game in game 5, and then some alongside Luka. The one game where Kyrie plays bad and Luka played fine, it's enough that he does not have that added boost, because really, I've talked about this before, that is the difference with this Mavericks team versus last year, is that Luka can sit. Luka can get away with not being on the floor 24/7, and arguably more significant than that, he doesn't have to worry about that while actively on the court, because he doesn't necessarily just have to do everything in the same way that he used to have to in the past. So if I'm Boston, I'm almost going to focus more on Kyrie. Luka's the most blitz player in the NBA, happens all the time. I don't know if it actually works though. The best thing you could say is that it does make your centers make short roll decisions, and that is entirely hit or miss depending on which big man you have, because Derek Lively is great at those decisions and Daniel Gafford is very much not. That's the best case scenario of those blitzes. Honestly, I think you just put Tatum or Jaylen on him on the initial matchup, and then you just have Holiday and White swarm Kyrie. What I think is something interesting Boston could do here is some Al Horford and Kristaps Porzingis lineups. This was something that they brought out a little bit in that March 1st game, and they kind of dabbled with it in most of the quarters and closed at least in part with it. I don't remember what their closing lineup was because Boston won by a decent margin, but the idea of Horford and Porzingis playing together, I think there's something there. I was trying to find the net rating of those two. There really isn't a great source for just like when they play together. At least I couldn't find it. But I think in that case, you have Horford guard the center, Derek Lively, Daniel Gafford, and you have Porzingis be essentially the roamer, the guy who is guarding Derrick Jones Jr., guarding. Obviously, that's a huge factor for Dallas, is whether or not their shooters actually hit their shots. And Derrick had a not as great series against Minnesota as he had in the previous rounds, which, is fine. I'm not expecting Derrick to continue to be lights out through the entire thing, but it will matter in this series. They also tried a little bit of Xavier Tillman and Al Horford. Obviously, Tillman is not a rotational piece for the Celtics at this moment, but it just does show you that the double bigs thing is something that they're considering, because I do think that they can ultimately defend the pick and roll about as well as any team in the league could defend their pick and roll, more so and better than Minnesota did. I'm going to talk about Rudy Gobert in a little bit, but while I do not blame Rudy Gobert in the slightest for that loss to Dallas, and I think there are a couple of fingers to point before you point it to him, defensively, there was a little bit of trouble with the drop coverage, and there is always a risk of that. Porzingis is a lot better at not doing that. Horford is pretty good, especially for his age. It's stepping up. And I think just in general, having the Horford on the initial big and that pick and roll, you have Porzingis roaming, ready to dig, ready to come out of the corner on Derek and make Derek Jones ultimately make a decision, because a Derek Jones corner three is a much less valuable shot than a Gafford or Lively lob or a Luka layup or free throw. So ultimately, disrupting that and settling for that result is the right move. Honestly, I think Porzingis is probably the most capable of disrupting an alley-oop player that Dallas has faced. Really, the only one I could think of is maybe like Jaden McDaniels otherwise, but clearly that didn't end up having much of a result. I do think that Porzingis would be pretty good in that department, and I think if you can have him dig out of the corner and just disrupt these alley-oops, that does break up a lot of what they're doing, and that's probably the move there. If you don't want to do that, the double bigs, because there is potentially an offensive trade-off there that's just not worth doing. Maybe there is a defensive trade-off there, like, you know, maybe you can exploit Al Horford in some way just because he's not as great defensively as he used to be, which again, he's old, it's fine. You know, maybe instead you go with Tatum actually guarding the center, because Tatum's a pretty big guy and he can defend Derek Lively and Daniel Gafford. Really, what I'm more worried about is, can he box out those guys? I'm more concerned about the offensive rebounding thing there. But if he can do a decent enough job at the bare minimum of holding them back while the big grabs the board, that would be great. And then, you know, I'm thinking he can handle Lively and Gafford fine enough. And then you have Porzingis doing that roaming off of Derek Jones thing. I just think his value is more significant in that way rather than just the one-on-one matchup against their fives, because their fives are not particularly skilled other than the alley-oop. So you need to be ready for that play. But other than that, I think Porzingis is a huge factor ultimately. I really think he is the X factor of this series and then some. Even if you don't want to go with that, if you just want to have Porzingis as the roll man, and then, you know, you can have a smaller defender, Derek White, Holiday on Luka or Kyrie, and then have Tatum or Brown helping off of Derek Jones, whatever it might be. This is a coverage that we have seen, of course, with Dallas, but I do think Boston has better personnel, more versatile personnel for it, which is key. The real thing to worry about with Dallas is the lob. I don't think a lot of people have quite appreciated how much alley-oops have gotten the Mavericks here, because vertical spacing is very much a thing. It's actually, I don't know if we could have got a better example of the value of vertical spacing versus just traditional three-point shooting spacing, because the worse the Mavericks looked this entire postseason is when they played Maxi Kleber at center. And I'm not blaming Maxi for that. I'm actually blaming Jason Kidd for that, although I will give Jason this. He did realize it didn't work pretty soon thereafter and made adjustments accordingly, which is all you can really ask. Sometimes you try shit and it doesn't work. That was one of those things that didn't work. The idea there, though, is that Maxi Kleber can shoot the ball, so therefore there's less defenders in the paint, therefore Luka and Kyrie get easier opportunities in the paint. That was a cool theory, and Maxi actually shot incredibly well from three, but they were still worse because having that option at the rim, even if it meant an extra defender in the paint, Luka especially, and Kyrie Irving too, are capable of making that extra pass to the big man more often than not. Speaking of that, though, I think Derek Lively needs to play significantly more than Daniel Gafford for this entire series. That is slowly but surely the direction that they have gone. If I do have one major criticism for Jason Kidd, who otherwise has blown my mind in terms of his coaching ability, because otherwise I thought he was kind of a shit one. But Derek Lively is slowly but surely playing more minutes than Gafford, and I think by finals, it needs to be a dramatic difference. Like, they're literally averaging the same amount of minutes. Gafford is averaging one more shot. He's averaging like 0.6 more blocks. And I get that blocks are cool, but Gafford is definitely one of those guys who his defense is louder than it is effective. And that's not me saying he's not an effective defender, because he very much is. No doubt Daniel Gafford should be in this rotation. That's not what I'm not suggesting otherwise. But Derek Lively objectively has been better. He has a significantly higher plus minus than Daniel Gafford. In fact, in their playoff rotation, just the main guys who have been playing, Gafford has bottom, it might be the worst or the second worst plus minus on the team, while Lively has the second best. Better than Kyrie Irving, more impactful than Kyrie Irving, at least, you know, according to these stats. Really, the main difference is the short roll decision making that I mentioned earlier. It's so bad that literally on the broadcast post game, Draymond Green was giving advice. They had Daniel Gafford go up with the TNT crew, and Draymond was there. Draymond was like, look, you got to keep your head on a swivel. You have the handoff option. Just bearing. He just did a quick coaching session on it, and it's because that's the worst part of his game. By far, and teams are routinely scheming to make him make those decisions, and he's not doing it very well, but Derek Lively does it. Remember that blitzing thing with Luka that I mentioned? There were multiple instances in the playoff run thus far for Dallas where the blitz came for Luka, and then Luka had to throw a pretty tough jumping pass to Lively, who would be around the free throw line, and there would be a defender between him and the basket. Lively could either drive into him, score, get free throws, or he would make the right pass to the shooter. Oftentimes, if there wasn't someone in front of the basket, when that pass from Luka comes, they have to rotate over, and then there's an open shooter. And the difference play to play, if you have a guy who can make that pass versus a guy who regularly can't, makes a huge difference on the offensive end. And then I even think on the defensive end that Derek Lively is a better player than Daniel Gafford, because again, he's not as flashy, he doesn't stand out as much, he doesn't have, as monstrous of defensive plays, but I think from a possession to possession standpoint, he defends better, he's more versatile, he is less, I don't know if stubborn is the right word. I think Daniel Gafford really likes chasing blocks, and I think he's very good at it, and it's fine, and more often than not, it's not a problem. But every once in a while, he jumps for something he shouldn't, and I don't think Lively makes that same mistake as often. They've been playing the same amount of minutes. Can't keep happening. I need more Derek Lively. Dallas needs more Derek Lively. Every advanced stat, my eye test, everything suggests it's just way better. Derek Jones Jr., PJ Washington, and Maxi Kleber hitting their threes, that remains key. It kind of always will. They have proven that they can hit those shots at this point, but I think teams are always going to give them the look rather than Luka and Kyrie. That's just kind of pretty inherent. I'm interested if we're going to get more Jaden Hardy minutes, because he was playing more and more as the Timberwolves series went along, and he actually made some pretty good impact. I don't know if he was that great in Game 5, but he was really good in Game 4. I imagine Jaylen Brown probably gets a lot of PJ Washington in this one, Tatum as well, kind of depending on what matchups they want to switch, because something I've realized from studying the game a little bit more intently than I used to is how much teams are throwing different defenders at guys, and not necessarily just because of a rotational thing or an energy preserving thing, but straight up just if you have to deal with a different matchup this time, you're not as gonna be as prepared for it. It's almost like the concept of muscle confusion. You do a different thing this time, you're probably not going to be as prepared for it, and it's going to hurt you a little bit more. So that's probably the approach they're going to have. But I think PJ Washington, I don't really think he has enough of a size advantage on Brown to really be a threat in that regard. It's just a matter of, how many open threes he gets. Now, moving on to how Dallas defends Boston. For the Tatum matchup, do you go with PJ Washington, so you have a little bit more size and strength on him? Or do you go with Derek Jones Jr., who's a little bit skinnier, not quite as strong, but he's a better defender and he's quicker? I feel like Boston in general, they don't necessarily beat you with quickness so much as they beat you with physicality, and that goes on both ends of the floor. I would argue that a lot of their offense comes from the fact that Tatum and Jaylen are much stronger than the average matchup they get. Frankly, Drew Holiday is much stronger than the average matchup he gets. So oftentimes they're using that strength to then create an advantage. I do think, though, for Dallas, they have strong enough defenders, literally not just, I'm not saying strength and their ability to defend, I mean literally strength, to the point where I don't know if they're going to be able to create those advantages as often. And whether it's Derek or PJ, I don't really think you can go wrong there. I think maybe Jaylen. I feel like Jaylen is slightly less about the physicality of it all and a slightly less tedious player to defend, so I would maybe prefer Derek in that regard. But Derek is also a much better defender than PJ. Not a much, but much better. Whoever does not end up as the primary defender on Luka that's probably going to be, if it's not JB, he's probably going to end up on one of those guys, is what I'm saying. One thing that is interesting, I gave all that praise for Lively, but in general for the center thing, how are they going to handle a true shooting five with no non-shooter on the floor? Because Minnesota had a lot of shooting bigs, but it wasn't often that other than when Cat and Reed are in the game at the same time, which isn't that much, you have Rudy Gobert in the paint, who's somebody you don't have to worry about overextending yourself outside of that paint. But that's yet another reason why I think Lively should be playing more than Gafford, because while I do think that Lively is not necessarily going to be great being pulled out of the paint by Porzingis' shooting, he is at the very least going to be better than Gafford, because that's another thing that Gafford is not as good at. He's much more stubborn about stepping out of the paint, which sometimes can be a good thing, but oftentimes is not, and I don't think is in this case. Porzingis can be a little bit shaky and inconsistent as a three-point shooter, so perhaps you get lucky and he just has a bad shooting series, and that allows you to, get away with Derek Lively out there more often. However, I do worry that Porzingis could just have an absolute heater, and then you have to do that Maxi Kleber lineup again for the sake of the defensive versatility, and then you're just leaving open opportunities there. It's like they create that one advantage, so another one is created. It's kind of a messy game, so I just hope that Porzingis' shooting doesn't hurt them too much, again, if he doesn't end up playing or frequently in this one. Now, what's interesting is who does Luka guard? I mean, it has to be one of Derek White or Holiday, I imagine. I think you can probably get away with Jaylen Brown at points, and even Tatum on the occasional possession. Like, Luka has been much better defensively, and he is a big guy. Okay, I mentioned earlier that I could not find the advanced stats for that Horford-Porzingis lineup. I just got a live update from Alex, so I asked to pull the numbers for me if he could. They have a 123 offensive rating, which is quite good, and a 109 defensive rating, which is quite good. And in the half court, 107 half court offensive rating, 94 half court defensive rating. The 94 is marginally less impressive, but still good. Still good for sure. So yeah, shout out to Alex Hoops. Go subscribe to him. He's a very, very smart guy. But between the two guards, assuming you do go that way, I feel like you probably go with Drew. I'm not sure. Because neither Drew nor Derek are like crazy off-ball movers. I feel like Derek is a little bit less stationary, but you don't want Luka to have to like run out of stamina by chasing these guys. Also, the fact that Drew and Derek are both going to initiate stuff off of the dribble, whether that's out of the screen and roll or whatever, he's going to end up getting involved in action, and is he going to fuck up or not? Getting both Luka and Kyrie involved in the action is going to be something that Boston does a lot. They are going to target them. For sure, that's inevitable. And it's not even necessarily because those guys have been bad defenders, it's just that they are objectively the worst defenders on the floor. In general, I think Boston's going to try to mix it up with their defensive schemes, but mostly Dallas is just going to play it straight up in the way that you would expect it to. I don't know if, the system that Boston runs is necessarily one that you have to scheme for to the same degree that you do for Dallas. Not because it's necessarily better, but it is easier to read and has not presented issues for teams in the way that Dallas has. Something that's very important is clutch factor. That's something that I'm thinking about constantly with this series. And frankly, with Dallas, I have started to value clutch factor more and more, because I've always had the perspective of like, look, the clutch obviously matters. I would be insane to suggest otherwise, but I feel like a lot of people just act like the last 5 minutes of the game is the only shit that happens. And if you execute in the first 43 minutes of those games extremely well, you don't even have to worry about crunch time. But in reality, these teams are very good. They're going to be competitive, and you're going to be close late in games. So then, who's better? Who does better under that pressure? Who does better in that environment? Because if it's Dallas, which I think we have seen every indicator that it is, that might be what determines it. Because Luka, and especially Kyrie, have been remarkable in the clutch. Remarkable. They are terrifying in the clutch. And it's like, okay, Luka doesn't have it today, well, Kyrie does. And if both of them are on the floor at the same time, and both of them have it going, good fucking luck. Boston is not known for their clutch factor. If I'm being nice, Jaylen Brown hit that 3 versus Indiana out of the corner to send it into overtime, but otherwise there's not much that's really been going on this postseason for them, and that's mostly because of their dominance. They haven't really been in that many close games, but I do know that in the past, this team's biggest struggle was when the pressure is on the highest, they crumble. And that means that they can get 99% of the way to the finish line, but they don't seem to cross it. Now, with that in mind, this is a very different Boston team, different personnel. I think the structure of this team makes a lot more sense. I think they're less reliant on Jason Tatum just being the hero for them, which I think is good because I don't think Jason Tatum is as good at being the hero as a lot of other alternative options would be. So, a more team-oriented, egalitarian approach is good, but I also don't really know what to think because there is this factor that I do want to talk about. I think I did talk about it briefly in a video. Maybe I did, maybe I didn't. Maybe it's one that got corrupted. Boston hasn't had much challenge to this point. Boston hasn't been under an immense amount of pressure for this entire postseason run, which could be a blessing, but it could also be a curse in that they're not ready to prepare for this shit when they're going into the finals. And given that we have seen multiple times Dallas executing, maybe the fact that they executed in the clutch so much means they'll burn out, but maybe it means they're doing it so consistently, they're so good at it, that you can rely on it night in and night out. At the very least, I think Dallas will be the more clutch team. So Boston needs to take the approach of, we need to score so much we don't need to worry about the clutch because we will be leading by enough. Just to go over a couple of other areas, both teams are basically even in rebounding in terms of totals. Dallas averaged about 1.5 more offensive rebounds, which isn't a significant difference. That will also be determined a little bit by the personnel of their matchups, but for what it's worth, at least thus far in this postseason, even rebounding. Dallas averages 4 more fouls a game than Boston does, but Boston actually averages 4 less free throw attempts. So this is a case of a low foul team versus a high volume foul drawing team, and then a high foul team versus a low volume foul drawing team. So I actually almost feel like it'll even out to some degree. Offensive stagnation and poor execution in the clutch is the biggest concern for Boston. That is easily the only thing that I'm worried about. Otherwise, if that wasn't a concern, I'm not worried about the Celtics in the series really at all. But for Dallas, in their case, it's Luka and Kyrie being targeted, them playing well enough through that and not being too physically hurt from it. As well as your kind of shaky shooters, which is really most of them that aren't Kyrie and Luka. Those guys actually continuing to hit their shots is very, very huge. Offensive stagnation is also a thing to be worried about for Boston, and that's another thing about Dallas is I feel like they're rarely stagnant with Luka and Kyrie. Their offense is pretty much always going. Not to suggest they don't have lulls in it, but I don't think the lulls of their offense is nearly as bad as the lulls of Boston's. They're also pretty mentally tough, extremely clutch, as I mentioned. They're just hard to stop. For what it's worth, Porzingis does help the Celtics not be stagnant. We only saw some hints of that in this Eastern Conference playoffs, but again, they just had one of the easiest matchups ever, which we'll talk about. But he adds a post-up threat. He adds rim pressure in general. He's a good roll man. The spacing from the 5 position is huge. So either way, he adds more versatility to their offense, which thus makes it less stagnant. And that's a factor to consider here. But yeah, that's another reason why Porzingis matters so much. As for my final prediction, saying all of that, if Porzingis is fully healthy, good to go from the onset, like literally game 1, I am going to go with Boston in 7, winning game 7 on their home floor. If that's not what happens, if he instead misses even 1 game, and especially two, or even if it's not missing, it's instead just being bad when he does play because he's still recovering. Whatever it may be, if he doesn't play more than 80% as good as he's fully capable of, more than 70, we'll say, I'm going to go with Dallas in 6. I think that Dallas will ultimately, with a less healthy Celtics team, prove to be better. I think a fully healthy Celtics team will prove to be better otherwise. I like the duo of Kyrie and Luka more. I like the roundabout approach and more reliable three-point shooting from the Celtics. This is an interesting matchup. While I say Dallas in 6 or Boston in 7, depending on Porzingis, I still don't feel confident in any of those because I've seen a lot of people suggest that Boston is just going to walk through Dallas. I think that's ridiculous. Yeah, obviously they lost less games on their way there, but Dallas played significantly more impressive teams. I would argue that maybe the Clippers not, but at the bare minimum, the last two series are far more impressive than anything that Boston played, and honestly, the Clippers are probably a better team than anybody that they played. Dallas in 6 if Porzingis is kind of bad. Mavericks in 7 if he's not. No, that's the same thing. Boston in 7 if he's not. But that is it. Shout out to Nick for editing this video, and goodbye.